The day Dale Coburn handed Elijah Monroe the keys to that condemned warehouse on Pratt Street, he was laughing so hard he had to wipe tears from the corner of his eye. "I'll tell you what," Dale said, still grinning like he'd just won something. "You want to play businessman so bad? Fine, I'll sell you the Pratt Street property, $2,200, as is." He spread his arms wide, gesturing at the crumbling brick facade behind him, the boarded windows, the rusted roll-up door hanging off one hinge. "Consider it your starter kit." The men standing behind Dale, his property manager, and two guys from the leasing office, laughed right along with him. One of them muttered something under his breath. Another shook his head slowly, the way people do when they're watching someone make the worst decision of their life and feel no obligation to stop them. Elijah was 22 years old. He had $2,200 in a savings account he'd been feeding for 3 years. $20 here, $40 there, sometimes nothing for months. He'd earned most of it doing odd jobs across West Baltimore, hauling furniture, patching drywall, helping a cousin flip houses on the weekends. He had no college degree, no family connections, no business plan written on anything fancier than the back of a Popeyes receipt. He pulled out the cash anyway. Dale stopped laughing long enough to count it. Then he signed the paper, and as he walked back to his car, a silver Escalade that probably cost more than the entire block, he said it loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't come crying to me in 6 months when you're back to hauling boxes." Elijah stood there in front of that building, holding the deed, listening to the Escalade pull away. The roll-up door swayed in the October wind. Somewhere inside, something dripped. A pigeon shot out from under the eave and disappeared into the gray Baltimore sky. He looked at the building for a long time. Then he went and got his toolbox. What most people don't understand about Elijah Monroe is where he came from before that moment. Not the neighborhood, though Sandtown, Winchester has its own story, the kind that gets told in statistics and obituaries more than anything else. What matters is the specific shape of his particular life, because that shape explains everything about what happened next. His mother, Renee Monroe, had raised him alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on North Gilmore Street after his father left when Elijah was 4. She worked the overnight shift at a hospital laundry facility for 11 years. Industrial washing machines. 6 nights a week coming home at 6 a.m., smelling like detergent and exhaustion. She never complained about it, not once, not in front of Elijah, anyway. What she did instead was push, hard. "You're not going to do what I do," she told him when he was 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while she ate cereal before bed. "I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm saying you're going to do something else." He didn't know what that something else was for a long time. He wasn't much for school, not because he was slow, but because sitting still in a classroom while someone talked at him felt like being buried alive. His mind needed to move, needed to take things apart and put them back together. He was 11 when he disassembled the building's broken intercom system just to see how it worked. He was 13 when he rewired the outlet in their kitchen after his mother mentioned it kept tripping the breaker. He was 16 when he started helping their neighbor, a retired contractor named Gerald Sims, with weekend jobs around the neighborhood. Gerald was the first person who ever told him he had a gift. Most people look at something broken and see a problem. Gerald told him one afternoon, both of them crouched under a kitchen sink on Mosher Street. "You look at it and see a conversation. That's rare, son." Elijah didn't know what to do with that, but he didn't forget it. By the time he turned 18, he was doing small renovation jobs on his own, replacing flooring, fixing plumbing, patching roofs after storms. He was good at it, more than good. He had the kind of instinctive spatial intelligence that no trade school teaches, the kind that lets you walk into a room and immediately understand its bones. The problem was scale. He was doing everything out of a milk crate in the trunk of a 2009 Honda Civic. No storage, no workspace, no way to take on anything bigger than a one-day job. He couldn't bid on larger projects because he had no place to stage materials. He couldn't grow because he had nowhere to grow into. He needed a space. He'd been looking for 8 months when he found the Pratt Street building. 14,400 square feet of condemned warehouse space in a neighborhood people had been trying to forget about for 20 years. It wasn't listed anywhere official. He found out about it by asking around, the way you find most things in Baltimore that matter. A woman at the hardware store on Edmondson mentioned that Dale Coburn still owned a few old properties in the area that he'd never developed. Nobody wanted them. Too much work, too many code violations, too much history. Elijah called Dale Coburn's office. The first time, someone hung up. The second time, he left a voicemail. The third time, a week later, Dale Coburn himself picked up, probably expecting someone else, and before he could redirect the call, Elijah talked. Fast and clean. He explained what he wanted, why he wanted it, what he intended to do with it. Dale went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what? Come see it in person. I want to see the man who's calling about that building." That was a tell, but Elijah didn't read it as one at the time. He thought it was an invitation. He didn't realize until he got there and saw Dale's face. The slight flicker of surprise, the recalibration, that what Dale had actually wanted was to confirm something he suspected. He'd wanted to see who was on the other end of that phone call. And once he saw Elijah, 22, black, showing up in a Honda Civic with a toolbox visible through the back window, he made his assessment in about 4 seconds. Then he made his offer. And then he laughed. What Dale Coburn didn't understand, standing in front of that condemned warehouse, was that Elijah Monroe had already done the math. He'd walked the building twice before calling. He'd documented every violation, researched what remediation would cost, priced out materials at 3 different suppliers. He'd mapped out how much space he needed for a proper workshop, how much he could potentially rent out, what the property would be worth if even half the neighboring blocks went through the revitalization the city kept promising. He wasn't buying a dump. He was buying undervalued infrastructure at a price that only looked ridiculous if you didn't know what you were looking at. But he let Dale laugh. He took the keys. He signed, and then he got to work. The first 2 weeks inside that building were genuinely brutal. He went in with a respirator, a utility light, and the grim expectation of finding things he wouldn't like. He found them. The roof had 3 separate soft spots. The electrical panel was a hazard from approximately 1987. The concrete floor in the back third of the building had cracked and heaved in a way that suggested a drainage problem underneath. 2 of the structural columns had surface corrosion that needed treatment before anyone could load them with anything heavy. He sat in the middle of the main floor one evening, after the light had gone orange through the gaps in the boards, and did the math again. Not the original math, the new math, the harder math. He had $110 left after the purchase. He needed materials. He needed time. He needed to keep eating and keep the lights on in his mother's apartment, because he still lived there, which was either the most humbling or the most practical thing about him, depending on how you looked at it. He called Gerald Sims. Gerald came out the next morning, walked the building slowly, and said almost nothing for 40 minutes. Then he sat on an overturned bucket and looked at Elijah. "It's fixable," he said. "I know. The question is sequence. You fix it in the wrong order, you waste time and money. You fix it in the right order, each thing you do makes the next thing cheaper." "What's the right order?" Gerald told him. "Roof first, because everything else depended on keeping water out. Drainage second, because the floor couldn't be trusted until you knew what was underneath it. Electrical third, because you can't work in the dark. Everything else after." Elijah pulled out a notebook and wrote it down. Then he went to find materials. This is where people who tell this story sometimes skip over the important part, because the important part is unglamorous and slow. It's not a montage. It's 3 weeks of Elijah driving around Baltimore before sunrise, hitting salvage yards and 8 estate sales and demolition sites, negotiating with foremen for materials that were going to get thrown away anyway. It's him pulling slate shingles from a condemned school in Cherry Hill that was being torn down, trading 2 days of free labor for the copper flashing he needed for the roof. It's him finding a functioning electrical panel at an architectural salvage place on Pulaski Highway for $80 that would have cost $600 new. He was not too proud for any of it. That was the thing. He understood, in a way that some people take decades to learn and some people never do, that pride is expensive and he couldn't afford it right now. His cousin, Marcus Webb, helped him on weekends. No pay, just loyalty, which is its own kind of currency. A guy named Terrence from his old neighborhood came by a few times after his shift and worked until midnight without being asked. Elijah's mother showed up one Saturday morning with a broom and a bag of cleaning supplies and didn't say anything about it, just started sweeping. The roof took 3 weeks. The drainage fix took 4 days once he got under the floor and found that it was actually a simpler problem than it had looked. A collapsed drain line that cost $90 in PVC pipe to solve. The electrical took 2 weeks and required a licensed electrician for the final inspection, a man named Dwight Patterson who did it at cost as a favor to Gerald, who had done a favor for Dwight's brother-in-law years ago, which is how a lot of things work in Baltimore. By the end of week 7, the building was no longer condemned. By the end of week 10, Elijah had a functional workshop in the front third of the space. Second-hand workbenches, reclaimed shelving, good lighting, a pegboard for tools, a small office area in the corner with a folding table and a used laptop. He stood in the middle of it one night after Marcus had gone home and looked at what he had built. Not what he had bought, what he had built. Then he called his first real client. Her name was Giselle Harmon, and she owned a small property management company that handled about 30 residential units across East Baltimore. She'd been using the same general contractor for years, a guy who had gotten comfortable and slow and expensive. She'd heard about Elijah through Marcus, who had mentioned him to someone who had mentioned him to Giselle's property manager. She called Elijah to patch a section of damaged hardwood floor in one of her units. He did it in 4 hours, perfect match on the stain. She didn't have to call him back about it, which was rarer than it should have been. She called him 2 weeks later with another job, then another. Elijah understood something about Giselle Harmon from the beginning. She was not going to take a chance on someone she didn't trust, but once she trusted you, she was extraordinarily loyal. He focused on that. Every job he did for her, he did as though his entire future depended on it, which at that point it did. By month 4, Giselle was sending him enough work that he had to bring Marcus on officially. By month 5, he'd hired a young guy named Devin, 19 years old, from the same block Elijah had grown up on, who could paint a room so cleanly it looked like it had been done by a machine. The shop was running, not booming, running. There's a difference, and Elijah knew it. He was making enough to pay 2 salaries, cover materials, keep the lights on, and put a small amount back into the business every week. There was no surplus. There was no safety net. If Giselle pulled her work, he'd have to scramble. But he was running. He started bidding on larger jobs, a gut renovation on a row house in Reservoir Hill, a commercial build-out for a small restaurant in Station North. He lost more bids than he won at first. He was still the unknown quantity, still the guy without a track record on paper, even if the actual work was excellent. He learned to document everything, photographs before, during, and after. Written timelines, client letters. He built a record because he understood that a record was the only argument that worked with people who didn't already know him. Month 6 arrived the way significant moments often do, quietly on a Tuesday without any ceremony. Elijah was in the office section of his workshop doing invoices when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Is this Elijah Monroe?" "It is. This is Sandra Coburn, Dale Coburn's wife." A pause. "I'm calling because we have a property, a commercial building actually, that needs a significant renovation. We've gotten several bids. I was given them by Giselle Harmon, who speaks very highly of you." Another pause, smaller. "I wasn't sure if you'd be interested, given the history. But Giselle said you were the best she'd worked with and I should at least call." Elijah was quiet for a moment. He thought about Dale Coburn standing in front of this building, laughing. He thought about the silver Escalade pulling away. He thought about the $110 he'd had left after signing that paper. "Send me the specs," he said. "I'll come take a look." The property was a 4-story commercial building on Howard Street that the Coburns had owned for 12 years and never developed. Dale had been planning to sell it, but the renovation costs to bring it to market were scaring off buyers. Sandra, who handled more of the business side than people assumed, had decided to renovate and lease it instead. Elijah walked the building with Sandra and her property manager, David Marsh. He asked good questions. He took photographs. He said very little that wasn't directly relevant. At the end of the walkthrough, Sandra asked him what he thought. "It's manageable," he said. "The bones are solid. Most of what looks expensive isn't, if you approach it right." She looked at him for a moment. "Giselle said you had a talent for that. For what?" "For seeing past what something looks like to what it actually is." He gave her a number 2 days later. It was not the lowest bid she received, but it was the most detailed, line by line, phase by phase, with a written timeline and a clause that specified exactly what would happen if materials costs changed. She called him 4 days after that. "I'm going with you," she said. He started the job the following Monday. Dale Coburn came by the site on the 3rd week, unannounced. Elijah was up on a lift working on the 2nd floor ceiling when Marcus spotted him first and said quietly, "Yo, you know who just walked in?" Elijah came down off the lift. Dale looked different than he had on Pratt Street. Not smaller, exactly, but more ordinary. He stood in the middle of the gutted 1st floor and looked around at the work in progress. The new framing, the clean concrete where the damaged flooring had been removed, the organized staging area where Devon was prepping materials with the kind of systematic efficiency that comes from being trained right. He looked at Elijah for a long moment. "Sandra says you're doing good work," he said finally. "We are," Elijah said. Dale nodded slowly. Whatever he was processing, he processed it without saying the obvious thing, which Elijah respected. Some apologies aren't said in words. Some of them are said in the decision to hire someone, to send someone a referral, to show up at a job site and look at what someone built and acknowledge it with a slow nod rather than a dismissal. Whether that's enough, that's a question worth sitting with. But Dale left without laughing. That was something. The Howard Street project finished 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Sandra Coburn referred Elijah to 2 other property owners before the paint was even dry. One of them led to a contract that kept his crew busy for 4 months. By the time the year turned, Elijah Monroe's company, which he'd named Groundwork Contracting, because everything he built started from the ground and worked up, had 5 full-time employees, a growing roster of clients, and a waiting list for new projects. He'd moved his mother out of the apartment on North Gilmore Street into a 2-bedroom house in Ashburton with a backyard she'd been wanting for 15 years. He didn't make a big thing of it. He just handed her the keys. Renee Monroe stood in the doorway of that house for a long time before she went inside. The warehouse on Pratt Street, the condemned, laughable dump that Dale Coburn had sold him while his employees watched and smirked, was now the operational heart of a legitimate business. Clean floors, proper lighting, a tool inventory that would have seemed like a fantasy 2 years earlier, a sign above the roll-up door, simple and black on white. Groundwork Contracting, Est. Baltimore. Gerald Sims stopped by one afternoon, unannounced, the way old men do when they want to check on something without making it sentimental. He walked around the shop slowly, the same way he'd walked it when it was a ruin. He looked at the workbenches, the organized storage, the whiteboard with the project schedule. He didn't say much. But when he was leaving, he stopped at the door and looked back at Elijah. "You know what the difference is," Gerald said, "between a man who makes it and a man who doesn't." Elijah waited. "The man who makes it decides what the building is worth before anyone else tells him." He left after that. Elijah stood in the middle of the shop for a moment, in the quiet, and thought about Dale Coburn handing over those keys and laughing. Thought about the $110 and the respirator and the utility light and the months of mornings before sunrise in salvage yards. Thought about what Gerald had just said. Then Devon called from the back of the shop asking about the tile order for the Howard Street punch list, and Elijah answered, and the day kept moving, the way days do when there's work to do, and the work is yours. Some people look at a condemned building and see an ending. Elijah Monroe looked at that same building and saw exactly what it was, a beginning that nobody else wanted badly enough to claim. He claimed it, and if there's something worth taking from his story, it's not that determination always wins. or that hard work is always rewarded, or any of the clean lessons that get stitched onto pillows. It's simpler and harder than that. The people who told Elijah Monroe what that building was worth were wrong. Not because the building was secretly valuable in some hidden way, but because value isn't something a building has on its own. Value is something a person decides to create. With their hands, their time, their refusal to accept someone else's assessment as final. Dale Coburn sold him a condemned warehouse and called it a favor. Elijah Monroe turned it into a foundation. The difference between those two things is everything.